Right. So as I was saying, we have our opportunity cost, which we just found. So what we're going to use this opportunity cost to find, we're going to use this opportunity cost to find a range of trade. That is, basically, we're going to find a range of what would be considered acceptable prices. And an acceptable price is going to be one that makes either country better off. So I see that Saudi Arabia. So at first I think about corn. And if I think about Saudi Arabia, right, since the U.S. has a comparative advantage in corn, we can think that the U.S. is going to want to sell corn, Saudi Arabia is going to want to buy corn. But Saudi Arabia will not buy corn for more than for oil. They will not buy corn for more than 4 units of oil, 4 barrels of oil. And the reason for this, if Saudi Arabia were to buy a corn for 5 oil, they could make it themselves for that lower price. So they're better off just taking the so if the US came in and said, "Well, we'll trade you, we want 5 oil for 1 corn," then Saudi Arabia would be better off just building corn themselves because they can get it at a lower price. But on the other side of corn, the US will not sell corn for less than a quarter of oil, right? Or a half a barrel of oil, right? And the reason for this is going to be, again, if the US were to sell it for 0.25 oil or anything less than that, they're going to say, well, we can just produce more oil ourselves, so it wouldn't be worth our while to produce that little amount of oil. So we have this with corn. So what this is going to give us is that the trade range, so our trade range, I guess we might say, will be somewhere between 0.5 will be less than our price, which will be less than 4. That is oil per corn and for oil per corn. Because again, that's the price I'm willing to work with. If we have any price outside of this range, either one of the countries is going to be in a spot that actually hurts their production possibility frontier. And same thing if we think about oil, and we'll see that this ultimately just flips it. But Saudi Arabia will not sell oil for anything less than what was theirs? 1 oil for 0.25 corn. So they will not sell their oil for anything less than 0.25 corn, right? And we'll see that the U.S. will also not buy oil for anything more than 2 bushels of corn. And that's basically what we have up here. We're just taking the reciprocals. So for here, we're going to see is that 0.25 corn for oil is less than our trade-off, again, in terms of corn per oil. And this will be less than 2 corn per oil, right? And that's basically just a reciprocal of what we found up here. So these two trade ranges are very closely linked. So we have these trade ranges, right? And we can sit and negotiate, well, where should it be? Where should it be? I'm going to suppose that we set our price, and it's just going to make things really nice, equal to 1 corn per oil. And so that would be equal to 1 oil per corn, right? That one, it works, so that's what I'm going to say the price is. So we come in, we negotiate, well, what should our price be? This is what we work it out to be. And again, the reason this will work out is Saudi Arabia is happy to buy corn and give up just 1 oil because that makes them better. It makes them able to live outside of their production possibility frontier. And same thing with the US. They'd be happy to sell they'd be happy with that same trade-off because it allows them to work outside of their production possibility frontier. And we put them together. That's what we're going to see in a few minutes. So let's put this together. Excuse me. So we have just that. And I'm going to kind of make a little chart. So we have Saudi Arabia and the US. Then we had our initial production, and this is with no trade. And we're just going to take a quick note of this. Again, this was already given to us. But we see happen here is that, let me give this one little more step. So we have Saudi Arabia and the US, and for each of these we have oil and corn. Or actually I can just do this with them themselves, so that works out fine. So we have something that's going to look like this. And if you come across a problem like this, I really encourage you to just take it step by step and make it work out. So our initial production, we said that is with no trade. We said that Saudi Arabia produced 60 oil. And they produced 10 corn. And same thing, the US is going to produce 20 oil, and the US will produce 60 corn. And we just want that. That's going to come up later. We'll see that again down the road, but that's for later. Right? I don't really need that, but I'm just going to leave a little bit of a gap here just to denote that this is kind of two separate things going on. There we go. So the second thing that we're interested in is what can we produce if each country specializes in their good? So we're going to have a step that's called production with specialization. And the idea here is that instead of saying, well, these are the goods I need, so I'm going to produce it, I'm going to come out and say, well, what could I produce what would I be able to produce if, what can I produce if I'm able to trade? So in this case, I'm going to say, what can I produce at the lower opportunity cost? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we're both going to do a pure specialization in the good that we have the comparative advantage in. So since Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage in oil, they're going to want to export oil. So their production here, we're going to say is 100 oil and 0 corn. Then the US will say that they'll do just the opposite. They'll make no oil and 100 corns. So we have this production, but now what we're interested in is actually doing a trade, right? So we establish this price up here as 1 corn per oil or 1 oil per corn. Basically, we can do one-to-one trades. So what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that we trade off 30 goods. So we're going to have a trade step. And with our trade step, we're going to see that Saudi Arabia is going to give up 30 units of oil, and they're going to gain 30 units of corn. Right? And I'm putting a minus 30 because they're selling 30 oil for 30 corn. And same thing, the US will gain 30 oil, and they will export 30 units of corn. Right, so we're trading 30 oil for 30 corn, and this is how any kind of trade works. If I go to the store and I buy something, I give the store some money, and they give me a product, right? I give something in return for an item or a service. And that's what we're seeing happen here. It's just a trade, just like when you or I go to a store to buy stuff. So after this trade step, we get to our consumption with trade. And this is where something really cool is going to happen. So when we have our consumption with trade, we just kind of work down the rows. So Saudi Arabia started with 100 oil and they gave up 30 oil. So now they have 70 oil. Similarly, Saudi Arabia started with no corn and they gained 30 corn. So now they have 30 corn. Then the US started with no oil, they gained 30. So they get, oops, I don't need our pluses here. But the US now has 30 units of oil. And the US sold off 30 corn from their 100. So now the US has 70 bushels of corn. So we have this new state. But really quick, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at our consumption without trade. And I'm going to put this down here just because, just so it's all in one place, nice and easy to see. So if we don't have trade, whatever we produce is what we consume. So these two are the same, or they're equal. Maybe I should make that sideways so that it's equal. So initially, if there was no trade, Saudi Arabia would have consumed and produced 60 oil and 10 corn, while the US would have produced 20 oil and what did I give them? 60 corn. So now we can see our gains from trade. So from here, to find my gains from trade, what I'll do is I'll take my consumption with trade minus my consumption without trade. Then I'll see how many more goods I'm able to consume. So in this case, I have 70 oil minus 60 oil, means that Saudi Arabia gained 10 barrels of oil and 20 bushels of corn. And then the US gained 10 barrels of oil and they gained 10 bushels of corn, right? So all these are pluses. So what we see happen here is that both countries are producing more of both goods than what they would have initially produced. And if we say, well, how could they, and then to just kind of show that this is an actual gain, they would not be able to consume that initial spot. How long would it take to produce our consumption? So our consumption with trade, if there was no trade. So what I'm interested in is, could Saudi Arabia produce 70 oil and 30 corn, or could the US produce 30 oil and 70 corn? So for Saudi Arabia, okay, we saw that we now have 70 oil, and at the beginning of class we saw it took 1 hour to produce an oil. So 1 hour per oil. And then they have 30 units of corn. And then it takes them 4 hours to produce 1 corn, or 4 hours per corn. And if it helps you, if it helps you as you're working through stuff, feel free, as you're doing math problems, like put your labels on and stuff like that, because it could help you out in keeping stuff straight. So when I think about Saudi Arabia, right, they have 70 oil times 1 hour per oil. This means that they're spending 70 hours on oil. But then 30 times 4 is 120. Yeah. So they would have to spend 120 hours on corn. So for them to produce this output, they would have to work 7 and 2 is 9. They have to work 190 hours. And then same thing for the US. We're going to see that we have 30 oil. And this takes 2 hours per oil in the US plus 70 corn times 1 hour per corn. And this will work out very similar. The US now is going to spend 60 hours producing oil and 70 hours producing corn. 70 and 60 gives us 130 hours. So the US would have to spend 130 hours, and Saudi Arabia would have to spend 190 hours to produce these outcomes. Keep in mind that both countries, but with this, we can say, but both countries only have 100 hours to work with. Now, since they only have 100 hours, in autarky or with if there was no trade, they would not be able to produce these outcomes or these they would not be able to produce these what they would not be able to produce what they're consuming. So we both became better off with trade. So just again, we see the gains from trade and we see this acceptable range of prices and so on. So that's the main idea of, again, comparative advantage, absolute advantage, gains from trade, and so on. And the reasons we may have this, and I'm just going to kind of talk about this a little bit longer, and then we'll be done, potentially a little early today. But the reasons that we're interested in this, so why would we have these differences? Or so that is different opportunity costs and different different productivity for each good and so on. So largely this can come down to when we talked about productivity, right? We talked about things like natural resources, human capital, physical capital, and so on. For this one, I'm going to emphasize more the land and our natural resource, potentially human capital. So when we think about our different opportunity costs and think about our land, right? So Saudi Arabia has a lot of desert, right? That is, they have a lot of desert. Whereas the U.S., yeah, we have some desert, but we also have a lot of farmland. We have a lot of grassland, a lot of land like Iowa, right? So when I think about why do they have different opportunity costs, it's partly because, one, we have different natural resources available to us. And also, if we think about something like farming versus oil, maybe people in the United States know more about farming than people in Saudi Arabia do, right? There's that chance. I'm not saying we do or don't, but maybe they do, maybe they don't. But different people have grown up differently and they understand things, different than other places do. So if even within the United States, odds are if I went up to a random Mainer, someone from the state of Maine, and a random Iowan, and I said, "Hey, here's a lobster. How do you eat it?" Odds are the person from Maine would have an easier time, getting the lobster, cracking it, and getting all the meat. Whereas someone from Iowa just kind of have to not be as confident necessarily as someone who grew up around that. And yeah, so again, we have these different experiences, different opportunity costs, and so on. But the next question that comes up is, what if you have a country who is better than the other country at both goods? So suppose that we have Canada. Suppose that we have Canada and France. And we are talking about syrup and, say, hockey pucks. I don't know, just go with it. We have syrup and hockey pucks, right, for Canada and France. And we're going to suppose that, again, and what we're looking at is hours per syrup in this first one. And for pucks, we're looking at hours per puck. Right. So we're going to say that Canada can produce syrup in 1 hour, and they can produce a puck in 1 hour. Right. In France, we're going to say can produce syrup in 2 hours and can produce a puck in 4 hours. Right. So what we run into is who has the absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So first, we're interested in our absolute advantage for syrup. We see that Canada can produce a syrup in 1 hour, and France takes 2 hours to produce a syrup. So syrup will go to Canada. And for the pucks, similarly, Canada can produce in 1 hour, and France can produce in 4 hours. So similarly, Canada will have the absolute advantage in pucks. So we have that issue again. It's a little not necessarily as straightforward as the other one because they have to because now we don't have these different absolute advantages, so we have to actually do the math, figure out what's going on with our stuff. So suppose that first we're looking for comparative advantage, and I'm going to first look at the opportunity cost of I'm going to go with syrup. Wait, no, I'm going to go with the pucks actually. So we'll start out with pucks. And if we look at our opportunity cost for Canada, this is just going to be 1 puck per syrup. Oops, or 1 syrup per puck. Right, and that's because it's a 1-to-1 deal, right? I picked 1-to-1 for that very reason is the reason why I picked 1-to-1. But they have that nice, easy trade-off, 1-to-1. France might be a little bit more complicated, but not too much. So we see that they can produce a syrup in 2 hours or a puck in 4 hours. So I'm going to say for France, in 2 hours, they can produce either in 4 hours, my bad. France can produce either 1 puck or 2 syrup. Right. So in this case for France, right, they can produce 1 puck or 2 syrup. So since I found this for the puck, the opportunity cost of a syrup, the opportunity cost of a puck would be 2 syrups per puck. Let's make this look a little bit nicer. 2 syrups per puck. That's because in the same time they can make 1 puck, they can make 2 syrups. So in this case, if we think about the opportunity cost, we see that Canada has a lower opportunity cost for pucks. So Canada will have the comparative advantage in pucks. And then similarly, if we look at our opportunity cost for syrup, we'll see that Canada, again, is equal to 1 puck per syrup. But then France will just do the reciprocal of what they had. They can do 1/2 puck per syrup. So France now has that lower opportunity cost. Excuse me. So France has the lower opportunity cost. So we'll say that France has the comparative advantage in syrup. And now we have our comparative advantages, and we'll see that Canada will. So with this, we'll expect Canada will export. They will export pucks, and France will export syrup. And again, I'm going to stick with 100 like we did a little while ago because it's a nice number to work with. So We're going to say, again, just like before, suppose that we have, so what if we have 100 labor hours per country? Then if we think about France and Canada, they have, again, syrup and pucks. Or I guess up here I did it Canada and France, so I'm going to keep with my shape. So I know that Canada is 1 and 1, so Canada can produce either 100 syrup or 100 pucks. And France can produce, they were 2 hours or 4 hours. So France can make either 50 syrups or 25 pucks. Right. So again, Canada is kind of the big shot in this example. They can make more, they can produce more goods, and they can produce more of either good. So what we'll get into here is, or excuse me, first we want to find a trade range. So we'll say that our trade, what was it for, if Canada's going to export pucks, this means that Canada won't take, Canada will not sell a puck for less than 1 syrup. And France will not sell a puck, or will not buy a puck for more than, we come back up to the pucks, France is 2. So France will not buy a puck for more than 2 syrups. Because again, if they did do anything outside of this bound, they could just make it themselves and be better off. So we'll see that 1 syrup per puck is less than our price, and our price, it'll be less than 2 syrup per puck. So we'll suppose that our price is equal to 1.5 syrup per puck. Or this could be, or the other way to think about this would be 0.67 pucks per syrup. Same way of looking at it. We're going to pick numbers where I'm mostly working at the 1.5 side just because it's easier. The numbers are a little easier to work with and they work out nicer for us. So next thing we need to do is we need to figure out what is a good starting number, what is a good production point production without trade and production with trade. There you go. So let's suppose that, again, we have our initial spot. So we'll make that chart kind of like we made a second ago. And we'll say that we have, again, Canada and France. And we'll first suppose that our production without trade for Canada is going to come out to 60 syrup and 40 pucks. And then for France, they'll start with 40 syrup and 5 pucks. So we have our production without trade to start with. And then the next step we're going to have is a specialization. And this production, again, is equal to consumption without trade. So the next step we'll have is a production with trade. And we are going to suppose that, so Canada just has to add up to 100. So we're going to give Canada, say they are going to make, say they end up making 40 syrup, and 60 pucks. I think this will work out nice. Then France will exclusively make syrup. So France in this case will say they'll make 50 syrup and 0 pucks. Right. Canada's 1-1. France, we said they can make 50. So this should work out. I'm just going to switch this over to a. I'm going to switch this over to a 55 and 45. And I think that'll work out for us. We'll see. Right, well, we'll have more syrup. Oh well. So we have our production with trade, but then we're going to have a trade step, which we said when we trade, we're going to be trading. We're going to be trading 1.5 syrup per 1 puck. So I want France to come out with 5 pucks. So France is going to import 5. Canada is going to give up 5 pucks. And that's going to work out fine for us. But then this trade-off, 1.5 and 5, means that Canada is going to gain 7.5 syrup, while France will lose 7.5 syrup. So when this works out, so we have our trade step, then we just work things through, and this will work out nice for us. So now we have our consumption with trade. And this will give us 55, and 7.5 gives us 62.5 for Canada. And 45 minus 5 is 40 pucks. And then France will 50 minus 7.5 is 42.5 syrups. And they end up with 5 pucks. So we have that. Then if we just come down again and we look at our consumption without trade, just as a grounds for comparison. Our consumption without trade again was 60-40. So 60 syrup, 40 pucks. And for France was 40 syrup and 5 pucks. So we have that consumption without trade. So our gains from trade are 62.5 minus 60 gives us 2.5 syrup, and 40 minus 40 is no pucks. 42 minus 40 is 2.5 syrups again, and no gains in pucks. So we see we have a gain in syrup, but no gain in pucks. And in this front, what we can kind of see is, again, it's not as drastic as if we have two countries that are, comparable. But in this case, it's not as drastic, but still, it works out fairly well because now we have nobody had to give up any pucks, but we both have more syrup now. So in this case, again, we have those gains. And just like in the other example, neither country could produce their consumption with trade. Alone. So even if you are trading with a small country and I'm not going to say, well, France is an undeveloped country, but even if you are trading with a small country or a country who is not as productive as you can still see those gains from trade. And granted, in this one, it's not as drastic as it's not as drastic or as necessarily easy to work out as the example where I'm better at one good and you're better at the other. But we still have those gains, and still, even with your smaller countries, your non-productive countries, there is still benefit to trade. So this is kind of the key points that I have with international trade, and that's where I'm going to end this video for today.